regardless of its outcome, reduces the psychological discomfort more than the rest would. But idleness aversion alone doesn't fully explain rest guilt. It explains restlessness. What explains the guilt specifically? The moral quality of it, the sense of having done something wrong by stopping, is a deeper belief that most people have never consciously examined. The equation that personal worth equals productive output. This equation isn't something people consciously adopt. It gets assembled gradually from repeated messages in environments that consistently rewarded doing and consistently withheld approval from simply being. Children who were praised almost exclusively for achievements, grades, performance, helpfulness, visible effort, and rarely for simply existing in a relaxed, unproductive state, learn a specific lesson. Stillness is neutral at best, suspicious at worst. Value is something produced, not inherent. And a person who is not producing is, in some quiet but real sense, failing to justify their presence. That lesson doesn't announce itself clearly. It doesn't arrive as a thought you can point to. It arrives as a feeling, specifically as the feeling that rest requires justification, that stillness needs to be earned, that the only acceptable form of stopping is collapsing from exhaustion rather than choosing recovery before the collapse happens. This is why telling yourself, "I deserve to rest," rarely resolves the guilt. The guilt isn't responding to what you consciously believe. It's responding to a much older equation, running below the level of rational thought, that has nothing to do with what you logically know and everything to do with what your nervous system was taught to feel when you stopped moving. There's a second layer that makes this pattern particularly self-defeating, and it's rarely discussed in conversations about rest. Monitored rest is not restorative rest. You sit down. Nothing urgent is happening. You have a few hours with no obligation. And instead of feeling relief, what shows up is a quiet, persistent discomfort, a sense that you should be doing something, that this stillness isn't quite allowed, that you haven't earned it yet. You might call it restlessness. You might call it anxiety. But what it actually is, in most cases, is guilt. Specific, directed, surprisingly sharp guilt, aimed at the act of doing nothing. And here's what makes it stranger. Knowing you need rest doesn't make the guilt go away. Telling yourself, "I deserve this," doesn't make it go away either. You can be exhausted, depleted, genuinely in need of recovery, and still feel, underneath all that resting is somehow a problem. This isn't a discipline failure. It's not laziness in disguise. It's a psychological mechanism with a specific structure, a specific origin, and a specific reason why willpower and self-talk alone almost never resolve it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this happens, where the equation behind it came from, and what actually needs to change for rest to feel genuinely possible. Not just permitted on paper, but truly safe in practice. Stay until the end, because the last part explains something about how rest guilt quietly makes your recovery worse even when you do manage to stop working. Let's start with the mechanism, because it's more specific than most explanations of burnout or overwork tend to acknowledge. Psychologists studying the psychology of idleness have identified a pattern they call idleness aversion, a measurable discomfort with inactivity that exists independently of how tired a person is, how much they've accomplished, or how much rest they objectively need. In a series of studies, researchers found that many people will choose to keep themselves busy even when the available activity is meaningless, simply to avoid the discomfort of being idle. The busyness itself. When you stop working but can't stop the internal monitoring, the background process, checking whether you've rested enough to justify the pause, whether you're being productive enough in your recovery, whether you should be doing something else. Your nervous system never actually enters the state that makes rest physiologically useful. Real recovery requires a genuine downregulation of the threat detection system. Rest guilt keeps that system partially active, generating a low-level stress response even during stillness, which means the hours you spend resting under its influence are less restorative than the same hours spent resting without it. In other words, rest guilt doesn't just make resting feel bad. It literally makes resting less effective, because the monitoring itself is a form of cognitive and physiological labor your nervous system is performing the entire time you're supposed to be recovering. This creates a compounding problem. If rest is less restorative because guilt degrades its quality, you never feel fully recovered, which means you return to work already partially depleted, which increases the total amount of rest you actually need, which increases the guilt around the time spent resting, which further degrades the quality of that rest. The guilt isn't protecting your productivity. It's actively undermining it, in a loop that becomes harder to exit the longer it runs. So where did this equation come from? And why does it persist even in adults who consciously reject it? For most people, the productive identity was assembled in environments that operated on a simple, unspoken logic. Visible effort produces approval, and approval produces safety. In childhood, this means doing your homework, helping around the house, performing well, and feeling the warmth of belonging that followed. In early professional life, it means working hard, staying late, being seen as dedicated, and feeling the security of a stable position. The association between effort and safety gets reinforced so many times across so many years that it stops being a belief and starts being a felt truth. Stillness is unsafe. Movement is protection. The problem, again, is that this association was built in a different context for a different purpose, and it doesn't update automatically just because your conscious beliefs have changed. You can know, rationally, that your worth is not contingent on your output, and still feel, viscerally, that stopping is dangerous. Because the part of your nervous system holding that association wasn't persuaded into it by logic, and it can't be persuaded out of it by logic either. So what actually works? First, stop trying to eliminate the guilt before resting, and instead rest in the presence of the guilt without acting on it. The guilt is not a reliable signal that you should stop resting. It's a habitual alarm going off in an environment where the original threat no longer exists. Treating it as data to be examined rather than an instruction to be followed is the first shift that makes a practical difference. Second, separate rest from reward. The productive identity treats rest as something you receive after sufficient output. Deliberately resting before you feel you've earned it, on a regular, structured basis, is what slowly weakens the association between stillness and danger. Not because the guilt disappears immediately, but because the repeated experience of resting without disaster gradually updates the equation from the inside. Third, notice the difference between resting and monitoring. If you're lying down but mentally inventorying everything you should be doing, you're monitoring, not resting. Choosing one specific container for rest, a walk, a meal without a screen, 20 minutes of deliberate stillness, and placing your full attention inside that container rather than outside, it is closer to actual recovery than hours of guilty, half-present lying on the couch. Fourth, trace the guilt to its specific origin. Ask directly, whose voice does this sound like? What specific environment taught you that stopping was unacceptable? Most people can identify a source fairly quickly. A parent who modeled constant busyness, a school environment where worth was entirely grade-based, an early job where presence was confused with value. Naming the origin doesn't dissolve the guilt, but it correctly relocates it from something true about your current worth to something learned in a specific place by a specific version of you that no longer lives there. Here's what ties this together. The guilt you feel when you rest was never about rest. It was about an old equation that decided, long before you were old enough to question it, that your value as a person was something you had to keep producing rather than something you simply had. Updating that equation doesn't happen through a single insight. It happens through the repeated experience of stopping, tolerating the discomfort that follows, and discovering again and again that nothing terrible actually happened. That discovery, made slowly, over time, through practice rather than understanding alone, is what eventually makes rest feel less like a risk and more like what it always actually was, a basic condition of being human, requiring no justification at all. If this explains something you feel regularly but never had precise language for, tell us in the comments what rest guilt sounds like in your own head. the specific thought that shows up when you try to stop. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind your own emotional patterns, the next video is right there, waiting for you.